Hello, Kahai. Today we've got a new segment. I've gathered a few creepy tales from Japanese forums. The things that scare people in Japan can be pretty specific, so finding stories that would still be a little unsettling for us was surprisingly hard. In any case, leave your thoughts about the video and the topic in the comments after watching. And now, without further ado, let's begin. Get comfortable and enjoy. Tanoshinde kudasai. First story, the Row of Jizo. This happened during summer break when I was a sophomore in college. There were 4 of us, me, Takashi, Kenta, and Yumi. We decided to drive to the sea, not on the highway, but along an old winding mountain road, just for the adventure. We were in Takashi's old minivan. Dusk was falling when we reached a remote mountain pass. There was no one around, only thick, dark forest. Out of our headlights, we suddenly saw them. Along the road, one after another, stood a row of stone Jizo statues. There were about 6 of them. Each wore a red knit cap and a bib things the locals had clearly tied on. They watched the road silently from the shadow of the trees. Then, Kenta the joker of our group came up with a stupid idea. "Bet I can turn all their heads," he said with a drunken grin. Takashi and I tried to stop him, saying it was bad luck. Yumi just stayed quiet and scared, but Kenta was relentless. "Come on, they're just rocks. It'll be funny." He jumped out of the car, ran to the first statue, and with effort turned its stone head 180 degrees so it faced the other way. Then the second, the third. He did it to all 6 statues. We sat in the car, and the sound of stone grinding against stone sent chills down my spine. When he was done, he climbed back in triumphant. "All right, let's get out of here," he shouted, laughing. We pulled away, but almost immediately, strange things started. The phone GPS stopped working, showing we were in the middle of an open field. Then the van's electrical system started acting up. Headlights would go out, then flicker. We'd been driving for about an hour, but the scenery never changed. It felt like we were looping the same stretch of road. The mood in the car grew oppressive. Even Kenta stopped joking and stared silently out the window. Finally, we got back onto a familiar highway, and a couple hours later reached our hotel on the coast. We were all exhausted and shaken, and decided to forget the whole thing, like a bad dream. The next day, Kenta complained of severe neck pain. He couldn't turn his head. It felt frozen in one position. By evening, it was worse. We were in the room when he suddenly started murmuring incoherently. We asked him what was wrong, and he looked at us with a glassy stare and said, "We have to turn them back. I have to turn them back." That night we woke to a terrible scream Yumi's. We turned on the light and saw Kenta standing in the middle of the room, his head twisted into an utterly unnatural position, looking straight backward. He didn't scream or move. He just stood and stared at the wall behind him. His eyes were wide open. We called an ambulance. The doctors were shocked. They couldn't explain how this could happen without a complete rupture of the spine. They took Kenta away, and we never saw him again. His parents later told us he had fallen into a coma. Panicked, we realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was because of those Jizo. Takashi, who had been driving, said we had to fix it. We decided to go straight back to that mountain pass and turn the statues' heads back the way they were. We drove back in total silence. It was deep night when we found the place again. The moon lit the row of statues. Their heads still turned backward. Takashi stopped the car, and we got out. We approached the first statue. Takashi took hold of its head with trembling hands to turn it, but he froze. He whispered for us to wait and told us to count the statues. I started counting, and when we reached 6, we stopped. There were 7. At the end of the row, where there had been nothing before, stood a 7th Jizo statue. It was the same size and the same stone as the others, but it had no red cap or bib, and its face was a perfect copy of Kenta's, twisted with horror. We screamed and ran to the car. We drove without stopping until we saw the city lights. It's been 3 years now. Kenta never came out of the coma. The three of us, me, Takashi, and Yumi, never spoke of that night again. We scattered to different cities after graduation, as if trying to run away from each other and from those memories. Sometimes when I fall asleep, I dream of that mountain pass. I see the row of 7 statues, and sometimes I feel an 8th appears in the line, and it looks a lot like Takashi. I'm afraid to call him to check. I'm afraid that one day there will be a statue with my face. Second story. Real it started when my friend, let's call him Akun, suggested we go to a secret place in Prefecture N. Another guy, Besson, agreed. The three of us often drove out to remote spots in Akun's old car. Akun insisted he'd found on some old map a road to an abandoned village with unbelievably beautiful views. We left early in the morning. After a few hours on the highway, we turned onto a country road that got narrower and rougher. Eventually, it became a barely visible track overgrown with grass. We realized we were lost. The GPS had long since lost signal. Evening was coming, and we were nearly out of gas. Just as despair set in, we saw a faint light ahead. It was a small village that wasn't on any map we had. It looked very old. The houses were built in a strange, archaic style, and on the walls hung talismans that looked like bundles of dry grass and white paper. The villages we passed were strange. They moved slowly, and all looked at us with absolutely blank faces. No curiosity, no hostility, just empty eyes. We asked one old man if there was a gas station or an inn. "No gas station," he replied in a monotone voice. "But you're lucky. Today is our festival. You are guests. You cannot leave." That last sentence wasn't an invitation. It was an order. They led us to a large old house that seemed to serve as the community center and gave us food. The food was tasteless, mostly boiled roots. All the while the villagers watched us silently. After dark, the festival began. All the villagers gathered on the central square. They wore eerie white masks with no mouth openings and lit torches. In the center of the square stood a huge stone wrapped in Shimenawa ropes. They started walking in a circle around it, making a strange throat-like hum. It wasn't a song, just a low vibrating sound that made your skin crawl. Periodically, one of them would approach the stone and smear it with something dark from a clay bowl. We sat off to the side, fear tightening around us. This wasn't a festival. It was some kind of ritual. Akun whispered that we needed to get out of there while they were distracted. Under cover of night, we slipped out of the house and ran to the car. Luckily, Akun had the keys. When we started the engine, the hum on the square abruptly stopped. We tore away without headlights. In the rearview mirror, I saw dozens of figures in white masks running after our car. They ran unnaturally fast, but somehow we managed to lose them. We drove all night until we reached a familiar highway. Gas was almost gone. We drove in silence back to the city. We thought it was over, but we were wrong. A week later, Akun called me in a panic. He said someone had slipped a bundle of dry grass under his door, exactly like the ones that hung in the village. Besson said he kept getting calls from an unknown number, with only silence on the line. I started thinking I could see people in white masks in crowds. The worst was Akun. He became obsessed with the village. He bought dozens of maps of the area and scoured forums trying to find any mention of it. He stopped going to university. When I went to his apartment, his room was covered with printouts and scribbled with strange symbols. "I realized," he whispered feverishly to me, "this isn't a festival. They pick someone. They choose real. I don't know what it is, but they choose real. And they chose us." He showed me a diary he'd started. It was filled with pages about that day, sketches of the masks, the charms, the stone. The last pages were covered with the same word over and over, real. 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 I tried to calm him, told him it was stress, but he wouldn't listen. That was the last time I saw him. The next day, he disappeared, simply vanished from his locked apartment. The police found nothing. A couple days after he vanished, I got an email from him. The sender was his address, but the subject line was blank. There was no text, only one attached image, a photo of that stone from the village. On the stone, in red paint that looked like blood, was written one word: Riaru. Besson moved out the next day, without telling anyone where. I moved too. I deleted that email, changed my number and email address. I try not to think about it, but sometimes more often at night. I go online and type the name of that prefecture and the word real into a search. I find nothing, but I keep searching because I need to know what real is, and what they did to Akun when they finally got him. One sleepless night, scrolling through dozens of abandoned forums for any lead, I found an old, barely working website from about 10 years ago. Its anonymous author described our story exactly: a lost group, the strange village, and the ritual. He was also obsessed with the word real, and theorized it was some ancient cult, and the festival was the choosing of a sacrifice. The last post on that site, dated years earlier, consisted of 3 words. They found me. A chill ran down my spine, and at that same instant I heard a soft rustle on the windowsill. My heart dropped. I opened the window and saw a small, tightly tied bundle of dry grass on the sill, exactly like the ones that had hung in the village. Without thinking, I grabbed it in a panic, threw it into the darkness, and slammed the window shut. It's nonsense. It's just nonsense, I kept repeating as I breathed hard. I've been sitting in the dark for hours reading this. Surely the wind brought ordinary dry leaves from a tree, and my imagination, worn out by fear, filled in the rest. That's enough for tonight. I decided to turn off the computer to end this marathon of paranoia. I pressed the power button, and the bright monitor went dark. In the slowly fading black reflection, I saw my room and something behind me. The door to my apartment was wide open, and in the doorway stood a motionless figure wearing a white mask. 3rd story, Kudan. My family was strange. We lived in an isolated house on the edge of town, and I knew almost nothing about my relatives. My father died when I was very small, and my mother was a very quiet, withdrawn woman, who, it turned out, was afraid of something. She never spoke about the past. Our house was old, and it had a locked room, a storage barn kura that I was strictly forbidden to enter. When I turned 20, my maternal grandmother died. While sorting through her things, I found an old wooden box locked with a tiny padlock. I opened it. Inside lay a thick diary with a yellowed cover. It was my grandmother's diary from when she was a young woman, right after World War II. What I read in it wrecked my life. The diary began in 1946. Japan was devastated by the war no work, barely any food. My grandmother wrote that she was lucky to find a position as a maid in the wealthy Katsuragi family, who lived in a secluded mountain village. They said the family had somehow kept their wealth even in those hard times. The Katsuragi house was huge and gloomy. The family were cold, proud people. The head of the household rarely left his rooms. Besides my grandmother, there were a few other maids, but they were forbidden to talk to each other about their work. The strangest place in the estate was the old white kura, with thick walls and a heavy door without windows. It was always kept locked. Sometimes at night, strange sounds came from it, either weeping or low animal-like moans. The head maid warned never to go near it. By 1947, my grandmother had worked there a year and learned more. The Katsuragi family had owned the land for many generations. Their wealth, villagers whispered, was based on prophecies. They supposedly knew when an earthquake would come, when there would be a good harvest, and when drought would strike. Several times a year, the estate took in young poor women from other villages. They were housed in a separate wing, well fed, but not allowed out. After some time they were taken into that white kura, and afterward disappeared. Sometimes they were paid large sums and taken away. Sometimes no one knew what happened. One night my grandmother couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for water. Passing the kura, she heard not just moans, but clear female screams, screams of pain, almost animal. Alongside them came a low, bestial bellow. She ran in terror back to her room. In 1948, she learned everything. One of the new maids, Asata-san, couldn't stand it and told her the truth before attempting to escape that same night. She never saw Asata-san again. The Katsurage family, my grandmother wrote, raised a Kudan. They kept in the cellar under the kura a huge bull that they worshipped as a deity. The women brought to the estate were forced to mate with this bull. When a woman became pregnant, she was locked in that same kura for months. In total darkness, she carried and gave birth to a creature with a calf's body and a human face. As soon as the Kudan was born, it spoke its prophecy. The head of the family and the priest from the local shrine recorded its words. Afterward, the creature died and was buried in a special ritual. The mother was either killed to keep the secret, or if she survived and didn't go mad, she was paid a large sum for her silence and exiled forever. Asata-san said my grandmother's predecessor was chosen as one of the mothers. She couldn't bear it and killed herself. When my grandmother learned that, she decided she had to run. "Tonight, I will leave no matter what it costs me," her diary ended. I closed the diary with shaking hands. My grandmother had managed to escape, but the story didn't end there. I started to connect the dots. My mother was born a year after my grandmother left that estate. My mother was painfully thin. Her bones in places were oddly warped, as if she'd had terrible rickets as a child. She never spoke of her father and was terrified of locked dark rooms. I remembered that when I was a kid and asked why we lived so reclusively, my mother would say, "It's safer this way." I remembered her strange habits. She would always flinch at the sound of bells and couldn't eat beef. I went to see her. She sat in the kitchen staring out the window with the diary on the table between us. "Mom," I began, my voice breaking, "what is written here, is this true?" She didn't turn to look. She was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "Not all of it. Your grandmother wasn't a servant. She was one of the Katsurage daughters, one of those who refused to take part in the ritual and escaped." My world collapsed. I whispered, "And you?" She turned. There were no tears in her eyes, only endless, drained emptiness. "They found my mother after I was born. They said the bloodline must continue. They took me when I was 16. They said it was a great honor. I looked at my mother and couldn't say a word. All her oddities, all her fear, our secluded life, everything was an echo of the horror she had suffered in that white kura. There was never a human father," she said. When I asked what was born, she replied in a lifeless voice that the creature had foretold a great earthquake in Kobe, and they were very pleased. For that, they allowed her to leave with the child. She looked at me with my future in mind. In that moment, I understood the full horror. Where one gives a prophecy, what does its twin brother, the one born human, do? I sit here and write because I don't know what to do. My blood is cursed. Something not human runs through my veins. Every time I look in a mirror, I search my face for the monster's features. I don't know who I am, the son of a woman or the spawn of a nightmare. Fourth story, the Village of Mirrors. When I was little, I often spent summer break at my grandfather's house in the village. It was a tiny settlement hidden deep in the mountains. Only a few dozen homes. I loved the place for its beautiful nature, but there was one thing that always struck me as odd. On every house without exception hung small round mirrors. They were everywhere, above front doors, on window frames, under eaves. Some houses were literally covered with them. As a kid, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was just a local decoration. One day, when I was about 10, I was playing with a sword in the yard and accidentally struck one of the mirrors on my grandfather's house. It cracked and fell, shattering into pieces. My grandfather rushed out of the house. I thought he'd scold me, but he wasn't angry. He was terrified. His face was white as a sheet. "Quick, help me," he yelled. He grabbed a broom and dustpan, and we carefully collected every single shard. Then he took an identical mirror from the shed and hurriedly nailed it in place. After that, he sprinkled a pinch of salt on the spot where the mirror had broken and muttered something under his breath. That evening, he was very quiet at dinner. Eventually, he looked at me and said, "I think you're old enough to understand. I'll tell you why we hang these mirrors." He told me an old legend passed down in the village. Long ago, he began, something started to come down from the mountain that towers above the village. No one knows what it is. It has no name. We just call it the thing that reflects. It comes at dusk and wanders the village until dawn. It looks for something to enter. My grandfather explained that this creature has no form of its own. It copies what it sees. If it sees an empty house, it might take the form of a chair or a table. But worst of all, if it sees a person. "It cannot enter a house where people are," he said, lowering his voice. "But it can look through a window. If it sees your reflection in the glass, it will memorize it, and from that moment it begins to hunt you. It will follow you wherever you go, and one night it will come to take your place. From the outside you will look the same, but inside it will not be you anymore." A chill ran down my spine. "And the mirrors?" I whispered. "The mirrors are our only protection. It fears its own reflection. Seeing itself in a mirror scares it away. That's why we hang them everywhere, especially on windows and doors. We create a barrier so it can't see the reflections of those who live inside." He looked at me with a heavy gaze. "When you broke that mirror, you created a breach in our defense. For a few minutes, the wall of our house was blind. That might have been enough time for it to look inside and see one of us. That's why I was so frightened." I didn't ask any more questions. That night, I couldn't sleep, constantly staring at the dark window of my room. I grew up and never returned to that village. Grandpa's long gone, but the story stayed with me. Sometimes, passing a shop window and catching a glimpse of my reflection, I freeze for a second and study it closely. I try to make sure there's nothing wrong. I try to make sure that the one looking back at me from the glass is still me. Fifth story, The Guests. I grew up in a large old house in the countryside. My family was fairly well off, and the house had been passed down through generations. As a child, my life was peaceful and happy, except for one strange and frightening thing. It was a family tradition. About once a year, sometimes less often, my father would announce, "Guests will be arriving soon." After he said that, a quiet panic would spread through the house. My mother and grandmother would wordlessly start preparing. They readied one specific room in the far, oldest wing of the house. It was a large room with totems. A room never used. They would bring in a low table and a few cushions. On the table they placed empty dishes and chopsticks. Then they would firmly shut the shoji the paper sliding doors. The rules for the day the guests arrived were absolute and unbreakable. First, after sunset, all family members must gather in the main parlor at the opposite end of the house. Second, no one may leave that room until dawn. Third, you must behave as if no one else is in the house. No noise, no loud talking. And most importantly, under no circumstances should anyone go into that wing of the house. When I was very small, I just sat with the adults, not fully understanding what was happening. I saw fear on my parents' faces. We sat in complete silence, and sometimes from the direction of the guest room I'd hear strange sounds. They weren't human voices. It was something like a soft whisper in an unknown tongue. mixed with wet smacking noises. Sometimes I heard a dull thud, like something heavy dropped on the tatami. My father would, at those moments, squeeze my shoulders tighter and whisper, "Don't listen." When I was 10, curiosity overcame my fear. I couldn't stand the secrecy any longer. Who were these guests that everyone feared but still hosted? On another night of their visit, when my parents and grandmother were in the parlor, I said I needed to use the bathroom. My father gave me a heavy look, but nodded. The bathroom was nearby, and instead of going there, I tiptoed down the dark corridor toward the forbidden wing. The sounds grew louder. I could clearly hear multiple voices murmuring. I pressed my eye to a tiny hole in the paper of the guest room's shoji. My heart pounded so loudly, I felt it in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself to peek through the hole. What I saw is still burned into my mind. In the dimly lit room, by a light from an unknown source, sat 3 figures around the table. They were not human. One had a long, horse-like face, but human eyes with no eyelids. The second had something like a mass of dark ribbons in place of a head, constantly writhing. The third looked like a huge bloated woman with perfectly white skin and many small spider-like arms. They weren't eating from the plates. They were eating what lay on the table itself. On the table, gagged, lay a person. He was still alive. His eyes were wide with horror, and tears streamed down his face. Those creatures slowly, methodically tore pieces from his body and ate them. I couldn't scream. I was frozen. In that instant, the horse-faced thing stopped chewing. It very slowly turned its head and looked directly at the hole in the shoji right at me. I don't remember how I screamed. The next moment, my father grabbed me. He must have sensed something and come after me. He clamped his hand over my mouth and dragged me back to the parlor. The sounds from the guest room abruptly stopped. That night, no one in our family slept. My father was both furious and terrified. "You ruined everything, Shepelon. They mustn't know what we know. That was our bargain." The next morning, the guest room was empty. No sign of anyone, only a torn cushion in the corner. After that night, everything changed. Misfortune began to plague our family. Grandpa's business went bankrupt. Grandma fell gravely ill and died. Years later, my parents died in a car accident. I was left alone. I sold the house and moved to the city, trying to escape the past. But I know the bargain was broken. Our ancestors made a deal with those creatures. They bring them food vagrants and lost travelers, and the creatures grant the family prosperity. But the main condition was total non-interference and feigned ignorance. I broke that rule. I don't know what those creatures are, but I feel they no longer wait for an invitation to the old house. Now that nearly the whole family is gone, they look for the last person who knows about them. They're looking for me. 6th story. Friend. I had a best friend. Let's call him Tatsuya. We were inseparable from childhood, grew up next door to each other, went to the same schools, and ended up at the same university. I knew him better than myself. Every habit, the way he laughed, his favorite food, stories from our past. We were like brothers. During our university summer break, Tatsuya decided to go on a solo trip for a couple weeks. I was a little jealous, but wished him luck. He left full of enthusiasm. When he returned, I was the first person he called. We met at a cafe. He looked the same as always. But when he started talking, I felt something off. It was a subtle, intuitive feeling. His smile was just a touch wider. He told me about his trip, but it sounded too smooth, missing those little funny details he always included. I chalked it up to post-trip fatigue. But the oddness continued. A few days later, we were at my place watching an old comedy show that used to make us cry laughing. Tatsuya sat stone-faced. He didn't laugh. I told an old joke that only the two of us found funny. He looked at me blankly and asked, "Is that supposed to be funny?" I began noticing other things. He started mixing up small details of our past. Once he mentioned we had a dog named Koro as kids, though our dog was Pochi. When I corrected him, he just shrugged. Ah, yeah, Pochi forgot. Tatsuya would never forget that. I began to distance myself. Every conversation filled me with an intense unease. I tried talking to our mutual friends, but no one else noticed anything. "What's your problem?" they asked. "Tatsuya's fine. Maybe you're the one who's off?" I started thinking I was going crazy. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe people change and I couldn't accept it. One night at a bar, Tatsuya told a story and gestured, and I noticed he was using his right hand. He held chopsticks and a glass with his right hand. But my Tatsuya, who I'd known all my life, was left-handed. I spent the rest of the evening staring at him, and every part of me screamed, "That's not him!" This person looked like Tatsuya, spoke like him, and had memories of our friend, but it wasn't him. It was a fake. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I went to his apartment and confronted him. "Who are you?" I asked. "You're not Tatsuya. Where's he? What did you do to him?" He listened calmly. Not a muscle moved on his face. When I finished, he looked at me with what seemed like sincere concern. "Listen," he said softly, in a sympathetic voice. "I can see you're not well. I worry about you. We've been friends our whole lives, and it hurts me to see you like this. Maybe you should talk to someone. Take a break. I'm your friend, and I'll always be here for you." His reaction was so perfectly calibrated, so convincing, that for a second I doubted my own sanity. He didn't defend himself or get angry, he just showed concern, and that was the scariest thing. I left him completely shattered. The ending came a month later. I got a call from the police in Agata Prefecture, the area Tatsuya had traveled to. "We found a backpack belonging to your friend Tatsuya," the officer said. "A hiker found it at the base of a mountain. There's no sign of the young man. We're contacting you because you are listed as an emergency contact." I went out there. They returned the backpack, and inside among his things I found his diary. The last entries were written in shaky, panicked handwriting. Someone was following him who looked exactly like him. The imposter smiled and waved. The imposter asked intimate details about his life. He was everywhere and wanted to try being him. He promised to take care of everything. The final line said he was leaving for the mountains. I sat with that diary and realized the truth. My friend didn't change. My friend was killed and replaced. The person now living in his apartment, attending his lectures, hugging his parents, that's a creature that stole his identity. I went back to Tokyo. What could I do? Go to the police and say my best friend is an imposter? They'd lock me up. I'm the only one who knows the truth, but I can't prove anything. I write this because I can't keep it inside any longer. Sometimes I see him from a distance. He walks with Tatsuya's girlfriend, laughs with his parents, and they're all so happy. He has indeed, as he promised, become a better version of my friend. And I just stand and watch, knowing the real Tatsuya rotted somewhere in the mountains of Agata Prefecture. I can do nothing, absolutely nothing about it. 7th story, The Box of Misfortune. This story began with the death of my friend's father. My friend, let's call him Akira, was the son of the head priest of a small Buddhist temple in Iwata Prefecture. After the funeral, Akira and a few of us helped sort the late priest's things. In an old storage room piled with ancient scrolls and ritual items, we found a long wooden box like those used for storing swords. It was wrapped in Shimenawa ropes, and the lid was covered in paper talismans, Ofuda blackened with age. On the box itself were only 2 characters, Ryomen Sukuna. We asked Akira's grandfather, the chief priest, what it was. Seeing the box, the old man went pale. "Don't touch that," he said sternly. "Your father left instructions that this box must never be opened. It must be transferred to a temple in Kyoto as soon as possible." Of course, that only piqued our curiosity. Late at night, when the old priest was asleep, the four of us sneaked back into the storage room. We decided just to peek. After struggling to untie the ropes and remove the talismans, we opened the box. Inside, on a silken lining, lay a strange mummy. It was smallest than a meter long and monstrous. It had 2 heads looking in opposite directions, 4 arms and 4 legs growing from a single torso, like 2 dwarf people fused back to back. The mummy's faces were twisted in agony. From it came a strange, nauseatingly sweet smell. We slammed the lid shut in horror, fumbled some ropes around it, and swore never to speak of what we had seen. A few days later, I went back to Tokyo, and a month later, Akira called me. His voice was full of panic. He told me that after we opened the box, misfortune began to occur in their village. First, there was a small but destructive landslide. Then a fire at a factory in a neighboring town. 2 of the friends who had been with us that night were in a car crash. One died. The other was hospitalized with serious injuries. Akira's grandfather fell ill with an unexplained sickness. Akira was sure all of it was because we opened the box. I decided to return to his village to help. At the temple, the old priest was waiting, sick. He realized what we had done and decided there was no point hiding the truth. He gave us an old diary kept by Akira's father. From the diary we learned a terrifying history. This box and its contents were a curse the priestly family had tried to keep contained for generations. Ryomen Sukuna said to be an ancient demon or powerful sorcerer who had been defeated and whose body was cut up. But this mummy was not him. In the Edo period, a group of heretical Buddhists, trying to gain immortality and power, performed a monstrous ritual. They kidnapped Siamese twins, and through black magic and alchemy, created from them this creature, an artificial Ryomen. They believed it would become their patron deity, but instead they created a vessel for calamity. This object, wherever it's kept, attracts misfortune earthquakes, typhoons, fires, epidemics. Akira's ancestors were exorcists who managed to take the mummy from the cult, but destroying it proved impossible. The only thing they could do was seal it and constantly move it from place to place, from one temple to another, so its destructive aura wouldn't build up in one spot and cause catastrophe. Akira's father was the last keeper. He was supposed to deliver the box to another temple, but he died suddenly and didn't make it. By opening the box, we broke an ancient seal. The curse began to leak out. The old priest said there was only one way to fix it: perform a resealing ritual. But for that they needed an anchor person who would voluntarily bind their life force to the curse to keep it contained inside the box. That meant a slow, agonizing death over several years. Akira, feeling guilty, volunteered to be the anchor. I won't describe the ritual itself. Suffice to say it was the most terrifying night of my life. We performed it in the main hall of the temple with the mummy in the center. The whole temple shook, candles guttered, and voices whispering in dead languages rose from the dark. When it was over, Akira looked as though he had aged 10 years. Much time passed. Akira died 5 years after that ritual, as his grandfather had predicted. He faded slowly, his body weakened, but he stayed lucid to the end, believing he had atoned for his guilt. Misfortune in his region stopped. I'm the only one still alive of the 4 who were in the storage room that night. Sometimes I think the curse didn't vanish, but merely lay in wait. Or maybe it's transmitted not only by physical contact, but by the story itself. And now, having told it to you, I have perhaps made you the newest carriers of this curse. 8th story, The Mountain. Behind the house. When I was a child, every summer I stayed with my grandparents in the village. Those were the best times. Their house stood on the very edge of the village, and right behind it began a dense forest that covered the mountain. I adored my grandparents. Grandpa was quiet, kind, and strong, and he taught me to fish. Grandma was the most caring woman in the world. But now, as an adult, I understand that my happy childhood memories were a screen for something very dark. I remember weird things that once seemed like quirks. For example, Grandpa would sometimes go for a walk up the mountain behind the house. He took only a water flask and a large hunting knife he called his branch tool. He would go all day and return late at night, always exhausted and smeared with soil. Grandma would meet him at the door, quietly take his dirty clothes and burn them immediately in the trash incinerator. Grandma strictly forbade me from going up that mountain. "There's a bad man up there," she'd say. "He might hurt you. Never go up alone." I thought she was just scaring me so I wouldn't get lost. Sometimes, when the wind blew down from the mountain, I heard a strange rhythmic sound. It sounded like someone far away chopping wood, but the noise was dull and intermittent. My strangest memory is of a red ball. Once I was playing at the edge of the forest and found a small red rubber ball in the bushes. I was thrilled and ran to show Grandma. When she saw it, she didn't smile. Her face twisted with a horror I had never seen. She snatched the ball from my hands, took it to the backyard, and burned it with the firewood, muttering to herself. I was very angry with her, not understanding why. Years passed. I grew up. My grandparents died. I had almost forgotten those oddities until a few months ago, when I began sorting their things in the house that was left to me. In the attic, I found a locked chest. Inside were Grandpa's old belongings and a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. They were local papers from the time I was a child visiting them. All the articles were about one subject. In our prefecture at that time, a serial killer was active. He had escaped from a psychiatric hospital. His targets were small children. He kidnapped them and took them into the forest. The papers didn't go into details. The prefectural police couldn't find him. He was like a ghost. There were photos of missing children. A little girl in a pink dress, a boy in a baseball cap. The last article in the bundle was about a girl named Ayako. She disappeared from a neighboring village. Her identifying marks: she wore a blue jumper and white socks. Her favorite red rubber ball was with her. I felt everything blur before my eyes. The red ball. I sat on the dusty attic floor as the disconnected pieces snapped together into a single unbearable picture. The bad man up on the mountain. Grandpa's solitary trips with the hunting knife. The rhythmic dull sound I had thought was chopping wood. Grandma's horror at the toy I'd found. The clothes she burned to remove traces and scent. There were no monsters in the village, no yokai or ghosts. There was a man who was the embodiment of absolute evil, and another, my grandfather, who, seeing that the police were helpless, did what he felt he must. He wasn't going for a walk, he was going hunting. He tracked that beast alone in his forest. And my grandma covered for him, washing blood off, burning evidence, and shielding me, her grandson, from that terrible truth. The rhythmic sound I heard was not an axe cutting wood. It was a shovel hitting rock. Grandpa didn't just kill the monster. He apparently found what was left of the victims and buried them decently. I sat on the floor and cried, not out of fear, but from the realization of the burden my grandparents had quietly borne my whole life so I could play in the yard. The full horror of my childhood secret was that there was no monster. There were only people. One person, the incarnation of absolute evil, and another, my grandfather, who was forced to descend alone into hell to stop that evil. That's the batch of Japanese creepypasta for today. Which story did you like best, and why? I'm waiting for your feedback in the comments. Also, tell me if you want more episodes like this. That's all for now. Sayonara.